Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Coffee with Craig. We very much appreciate you guys tuning in and liking and sharing these videos. Remember, subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Facebook, subscribe to our podcast if you get a chance. Would love to have you guys joining us and helping others to join in the conversation. Also, want to remind you, go to fpcgear.com. That's fpcgear.com. Folks, I was just on the website this morning, and we have tons of new designs. I mean, here's just a few of them. All right, so if you check these shirts out right here, these things are really, really cool. These are just 3 of the newest designs that we have. We have the Equality here in the green. We also have it in a couple of others. We have the Rights Are Greater Than Feelings, and we also have Forget Gold, Invest in Brass. These are just 3 of the very cool designs that we have at fpcgear.com. So check them out. Go there. Know that every dollar that you spend will go right back into the fight for our constitutional right to keep and bear arms. That's fpcgear.com. All right. I have to tell you, and this is somewhat gun related, but it's an issue that, quite frankly, is bigger than guns, or bigger than the Second Amendment, in that it really comes to do with some of the real fundamental problems with our government as it exists right now, and how we govern. A fundamental understanding of our 3-branch form of government. And what we have found is, those of us who believe in the Second Amendment have found our Second Amendment rights, as well as other rights, we found them to fall victim to this failure of government to actually do what it is that it's supposed to do. What am I speaking of, you ask? Well, an individual who talked about this in far more articulate terms than I ever could. Senator Ben Sasse from Nebraska yesterday. He was speaking, he was doing kind of his opening statement before the Kavanaugh hearing, and he had a chance to pontificate as to why the hearing process had become so politicized. Because he recognized that it was, and it was not something that was ever meant to be, but that in fact was what it had become, and it had become overly politicized. And he summed it up in really four main points that he wanted to make in his conversation. And here's a brief summary of those 4 points.
Number 1, in our system, the legislative branch is supposed to be the center of our politics. Number 2, it's not. Why not? Because for the last century, and increasing by the decade right now, more and more legislative authority is delegated to the executive branch every year. Both parties do it. The legislature is impotent, the legislature is weak, and most people here want their jobs more than they really want to do legislative work, and so they punt most of the work to the next branch. Third consequence is that this transfer of power means the people yearn for a place where politics can actually be done. And when we don't do a lot of big actual political debating here, we transfer it to the Supreme Court. And that's why the Supreme Court is increasingly a substitute political battleground in America. It is not healthy, but it is what happens, and it's something that our founders wouldn't be able to make any sense of. And fourth and finally, we badly need to restore the proper duties and the balance of power from our constitutional system.
Now, I don't know that I could have ever expressed it any better, but what I really liked about what he did was he broke down each one of those points, and we're going to talk a little bit about each one of those points as they relate to the fight for the Second Amendment and the fight for our constitutional right to keep and bear arms. And you're going to see where that failure has taken place and what that's meant for our right to keep and bear arms, and what it will mean if we're not successful in restoring the balance of government that he talked about. So let's start with the first point that he made, where he talked about the legislative branch being where the politics are supposed to take place. I mean, this is, in fact, where laws are supposed to be made in the legislative branch. But he notes that just doesn't seem to be the case these days. Check it out.
The legislative branch is supposed to be the locus of our politics, properly understood. Since we're here in this room today, because this is a Supreme Court confirmation hearing, we're tempted to start with Article 3. But really, Article 3 is the part of the Constitution that sets up the judiciary. We really should be starting with Article 1, which is us. What is the legislature's job? The Constitution's drafters began with the legislature. These are equal branches, but Article 1 comes first for a reason, and that's because policymaking is supposed to be done in the body that makes laws. That means that this is supposed to be the institution dedicated to political fights. If we see lots and lots of protests in front of the Supreme Court, that's a pretty good litmus test barometer of the fact that our republic isn't healthy. Because people shouldn't be thinking they are protesting in front of the Supreme Court. They should be protesting in front of this body. The legislature is designed to be controversial, noisy, sometimes even rowdy, because making laws means we have to hash out the reality that we don't all agree. Government is about power. Government is not just another word for things we do together. The reason we have limited government in America is because we believe in freedom. We believe in souls. We believe in persuasion. We believe in love. And those things aren't done by power. But the government acts by power. And since the government acts by power, we should be reticent to use power. And so it means when you differ about power, you have to have a debate. And this institution is supposed to be dedicated to debate and should be based on the premise that we know since we don't all agree, we should try to constrain that power just a little bit, but then we should fight about it and have a vote in front of the American people. And then what happens? The people get to decide whether they want to hire us or fire us. They don't have to hire us again. This body is the political branch where policymaking fights should happen. And if we are the easiest people to fire, it means the only way the people can maintain power in our system is if almost all the politicized decisions happen here, not in Article 2 or Article 3.
Well, now that's a great point, because when you start talking about where the power resides, the fact is they don't want to make the tough decisions. They want to make the popular decisions. In particular, the popular decisions in their district. They don't want to actually take the time to look at the actual legislation and determine, is this constitutional or is this not constitutional? Will this actually do what we believe it will do or not? Let's not listen to all of the information. Let's just listen to the information that is popular on the folks on our side. Because for many of these people, being in office, it's their celebrity. It's their way to be popular. It has devolved into a popularity contest. And as a result, we have a bunch of legislators who really aren't interested in doing real substantive policy. And I'm talking on both sides of the aisle. You have one party who does not believe they have to listen to those who disagree. Because, well, hey, we're in the majority. So because we're in the majority, we don't have to listen to the minority. We don't have to listen to find out if they're actually coming up with substantive facts and information. And we see that all the time when lobbying on Second Amendment issues. The fact that things actually are not going to work, that a bill is worded wrongly, that a bill is not going to do something that they claim it's going to do, they really don't care. See, listening to that, figuring out how to address that, and sometimes not going forward with your idea, that's the tough work. Because when you find out that it's really not going to work, and you realize the only people that it's going to impact are law-abiding citizens, well, then you have constituents you have to go back to, and you have to actually explain why you did what you did, instead of simply doing what they want you to do, or what you believe they want you to do, or what pollsters tell them that they want them to do. That's the hard work. All right, so why? Why do legislators abdicate their responsibility? He gets into that. That was point number 2.
How do we get to a place where the legislature decided to give away its power? We've been doing it for a long time. Over the course of the last century, but especially since the 1930s and then ramping up since the 1960s, a whole lot of the responsibility in this body has been kicked to a bunch of alphabet soup bureaucracies. All the acronyms that people know about their government or don't know about their government are the places where most actual policy making, kind of in a way lawmaking, is happening right now. This is not what Schoolhouse Rock says. There's no verse of Schoolhouse Rock that says give a whole bunch of power to the alphabet soup agencies and let them decide what the governance decision should be for the people, because the people don't have any way to fire the bureaucrats. And so what we mostly do around this body is not pass laws. What we mostly do is decide to give permission to the secretary or the administrator of bureaucracy X, Y, or Z to make law-like regulations. That's mostly what we do here. We go home and we pretend we make laws. No, we don't. We write giant pieces of legislation, 1,200 pages, 1,500 pages long, that people haven't read, filled with all these terms that are undefined, and we say the secretary of such and such shall promulgate rules that do the rest of our dang jobs. That's why there's so many fights about the executive branch and about the judiciary, because this body rarely finishes its work. And the House is even worse. At the end of the day, a lot of the power delegation that happens from this branch is because the Congress has decided to self-neuter. Well, guess what? The important thing isn't whether or not the Congress has lame jobs. The important thing is that when the Congress neuters itself and gives power to an unaccountable fourth branch of government, it means the people are cut out of the process. There's nobody in Nebraska, there's nobody in Minnesota or Delaware who elected the Deputy Assistant Administrator of Plant Quarantine at the USDA. And yet if the Deputy Assistant Administrator of Plant Quarantine does something to make Nebraskans' lives really difficult, which happens to farmers and ranchers in Nebraska, who do they protest to? Where do they go? How do they navigate the complexity and the thicket of all the lobbyists in this town to do executive agency lobbying? They can't. And so what happens is they don't have any ability to speak out and to fire people through an election. And so ultimately, when the Congress is neutered, when the administrative state grows, when there is this fourth branch of government, it makes it harder and harder for the concerns of citizens to be represented and articulated by people that the people know that they have power over. All the power right now, or almost all the power right now, happens off stage. And that leaves a lot of people wondering, who's looking out for me?
That was a mic drop moment. It was a mic drop moment, in particular when you start thinking about how regulations are promulgated relating to firearms. Oftentimes, legislatures, state legislatures, pass laws relating to firearms, in particular, gun control, bans. You can't have this, you can't do that, this, that, and the other. They pass these laws with no real understanding of how the process works. And then they pass it over to, in the state of California, that would be the Department of Justice, Bureau of Firearms, and they don't know how to implement these laws. Because oftentimes, the way the law has been written is a hot ghetto mess. They hand the Department of Justice a steaming pile of chicken manure, and they're told to make chicken salad. There are no master chefs in the California Department of Justice that can, with all the mayonnaise in the world, take some of this legislation and make chicken salad out of it. Because the legislation is written so poorly, because legislators just want to do what's popular. They just want to make these big, huge bills that, once again, that no one is going to really read, and you know that no one is reading them, because oftentimes members, when they're sitting there presenting their very own bill, they're reading cue cards because they don't know what's in their own bill. There's a reason why you have in these committees, they limit 2 people to testify on each side. They give them 2 minutes each because they really don't want to hear about all the complexities, about all of the impacts that this legislation is going to have. They don't want to hear from the experts who maybe have a perspective that is different from theirs, because they have made up their minds before they walk into the committee how they're going to vote. Why? Because it's politically expedient. And so, as the good senator pointed out, they self-neuter. Why do they self-neuter? Because then it's easier. So then all I have to do is go to press conferences and community meetings. I just have to open up libraries and stand in front of the camera and look pretty. Because I don't really have to make legislation anymore. I really don't have to make rules or laws. I don't have to spend time actually knowing what I'm talking about. In particular, if I'm looking to ban guns. Why? Because, well, guns. And that gets to the third point. Check us out.
The solution here is not to try to find judges who will be policymakers. The solution is not to try to turn the Supreme Court into an election battle for TV. The solution is to restore a proper constitutional order with a balance of powers. We need Schoolhouse Rock back. We need a Congress that writes laws and then stands before the people and suffers the consequences and gets to go back to our own Mount Vernon if that's what the electors decide. We need an executive branch that has a humble view of its job as enforcing the law, not trying to write laws in the Congress's absence. And we need a judiciary that tries to apply written laws to facts and cases that are actually before it.
Exactly. Now, unfortunately, that was the fourth clip. So that was the fourth and final point. That was the summation of what we need to do in order to restore our government to what it is supposed to be. The third point, and really maybe it's better that we're actually doing this third, because it really then gets to why having the judiciary be what it is has become so dysfunctional. Why, in fact, it is so dysfunctional. Check it out.
The Supreme Court becomes our substitute political battleground. It's only 9 people. You can know them, you can demonize them, you can try to make them messiahs, but ultimately, because people can't navigate their way through the bureaucracy, they turn to the Supreme Court looking for politics. And knowing that our elected officials no longer care enough to do the hard work of reasoning through the places where we differ and deciding to shroud our power at times, it means that we look for 9 justices to be super legislators. We look for 9 justices to try to right the wrongs from other places in the process. When people talk about wanting to have empathy from their justices, this is what they're talking about. They're talking about trying to make the justices do something that the Congress refuses to do as it constantly abdicates its responsibility.
And that's what we wind up doing. Right now, you have legislators that pass bills, in some cases either not knowing or not caring whether or not a piece of legislation is actually constitutional or not. They don't care. They're going to pass it, and they're going to let the judges decide. And we're not just talking about the Supreme Court. We're talking about the judiciary. And so more and more, we're looking for justices that agree with us. Now, I happen to believe that if we have justices who actually do what they're supposed to do, interpret the law as it is written, compare it to the Constitution as it is written, and then determines whether or not it is consistent with the law, I happen to believe that 9 times out of 10, we're going to wind up victorious. But that's not what we want. Oftentimes on our side, we just want someone who agrees with us. Well, the problem is that's part of the dysfunction. That is part of the entire dysfunction of government. But on the left, they completely all of them, they just want someone who's simply going to agree with them. Someone whose goal it is to right wrongs as they see it. One only has to take a look at the Ninth Circuit and look at how the Ninth Circuit in decision after decision, in particular when it comes to firearms, ignores the law, ignores court rulings, and they simply go based on what they feel. In some cases, we've seen the Ninth Circuit on gun cases ignore all of the relevant facts, all of the points that have been made in the lower court decision, and they just throw them out. And they just say, this is what we're going to decide on, and this is how we're going to decide, and may or may not be based on the rule of law. If we can find law that agrees with us, great. That's what we'll base it on. But if we don't, great, we're going to right the wrongs because that is what our job is. You have justices who believe that, and they're appointed by individuals who believe that's their job, which is completely unlike how it was supposed to be, how it was ever meant to be. So now we have Justice Kavanaugh, who is likely going to be the newest member to the United States Supreme Court. And what I will say is this, what I very much appreciate about everything that I've heard is that he is not interested in being an activist judge. He's interested in interpreting the law as it applies to the Constitution. But we as a people, we as voters, we need to get back to the Constitution. We need to demand that the people that we elect to office obey the Constitution and do their jobs, that legislators don't abdicate their responsibility when it comes to a lot of this stuff to the judicial branch or to the executive branch. Because those bureaucrats, I bet you cannot even tell me who is it who is the director of the Bureau of Firearms? Anyone? Bueller? Yeah, some of you are old enough to remember that reference. But that's the thing, is that most of us don't know. They're appointed, they're unelected, and they change at the whim of whoever appoints them. And we in the state of California happen to have an attorney general who's more of a politician than he is an actual keeper of the law. He's more interested in suing the White House than he is in actually protecting the rights of people in the state of California. Those of you in Washington with Mr. Ferguson, you're dealing with the same exact thing. Someone who really isn't interested in the rule of law. He's more interested in press releases and in getting reelected or elected to the next office. And as long as the politicians choose to abdicate their responsibility and choose to ignore the Constitution, or no, let me take a step back. As long as we allow the politicians to abdicate their responsibility and ignore the Constitution, then they will continue to do it. And we'll continue to see the imbalance of power that will take place in these United States, or in states like California, where it has, in essence, become a three-ring circus. So anyway, if you look in the description of this video, you can see his entire presentation. I mean, Ben Sasse just really knocked it out of the park on this one. And it's funny because it really was about kind of the whole circus of the thing, was a lot less about Ben Kavanaugh. But I thought it was one of the most profound speeches that I've heard in a very long time, and one of the most truthful speeches that I've heard in a very long time coming out of the United States Senate. And all I can say is I wish he was my senator. Fortunately not. Anyway, folks, that's going to be it for today's Coffee with Craig. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you so much for liking and sharing these videos. Please remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Please remember to follow us on Facebook. Click the notification button so that you can get notifications as soon as these things go live. And if you want to listen to us on audio podcast, we're on Apple iTunes, we're on Apple Podcast, we're on Google Podcast. If you want to know all the different services we're on, follow the link, anchor.fm/Coffee with Craig, and you can find all the different services. Anyway, folks, that's going to be it for today's Coffee with Craig. Thank you so much for tuning in. Remember, we are the home in the fight for civil rights. Got to use them, or you're going to lose them. You guys take care.
If you like our videos, follow, subscribe, like, and share.